The wind carried the smell of damp earth the morning Maggie Hale first stepped onto the overgrown driveway of the abandoned mansion. It was a smell that clung to old secrets, cold, metallic, and strangely sweet, like the memory of something that wished to stay buried. She had been told countless times that homes like this didn't just sit empty for decades. Not unless there was a reason. But she dismissed the town's warnings the way she dismissed the ache in her knees, quietly, gently, telling herself she had lived long enough to know when fear was only a shadow pretending to be real. But she was wrong. Because on her third night inside that house, long after she had cleared the dust from the hallway and patched a corner of the kitchen wall, she heard something faint, muffled, impossibly human, coming from behind the fireplace. And when the experts finally arrived 2 weeks later, men with equipment she had never seen and faces she will never forget, they didn't speak. They didn't breathe. They only stared at the wall with a kind of terror reserved for those who know exactly what they're looking at. What Maggie Hale found hidden inside that mansion would not only shake her life, it would shake the entire town of Redwood Falls. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I read every single one. The story, however, does not begin with the discovery. It begins with a widow searching for a place where silence didn't feel like punishment. Maggie Hale had spent 58 years learning how to live gently in a world that rarely returned the favor. She spoke softly, walked slowly, and carried a presence so quiet that most people forgot she was in the room until she stepped out of it. She wasn't invisible, just tired in a way only grief could sculpt, tired in the places no one else could see. Her late husband, Thomas, had been the loud one, big laugh, big dreams, big footsteps, echoing through their small Ohio home. When he died 6 years earlier, suddenly, unfairly, inexplicably, Maggie found herself shrinking into her own life, folding into routines that felt safe but hollow. Morning tea, evening walks, quiet dinners, alone. She spoke to him sometimes, out loud, in whispers. Not because she believed he could hear her, but because the silence frightened her more than loneliness. By the end of her 5th year without him, the house they had shared no longer felt like home. It felt like a mausoleum of ordinary days, faded curtains, untouched photos, and too many memories that pressed against her ribs like stones. So when she saw the listing, abandoned estate, $100, Shades, Redwood Falls, PA, cash only, something stirred inside her, a faint spark she didn't immediately recognize as hope. The price was absurd. The house was enormous, clearly rotting, clearly neglected. It had been owned by a wealthy family in the 1920s. Some said it had ties to the Romano crime family. Others swore it was cursed, touched by the wrong kind of men. But Maggie didn't believe in curses. She believed in architecture, in woodwork, in stories etched into walls. Most of all, she believed in the possibility of starting over. Redwood Falls was smaller than she imagined, a quiet Pennsylvanian town tucked between dense forests and winding back roads. The kind of place where everyone nodded at everyone else, where wind carried the scent of pine and wet leaves, where silence held a weight of its own. When she arrived to sign the papers, the clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked at her with a pitying softness and said, "You're buying that place? The Romano estate?" Maggie only nodded. The woman hesitated before adding, almost whispering, "I hope you're someone who believes in the truth." Maggie didn't know what that meant. Not yet. The mansion sat on a lonely hill, its tall iron gate rusted open as if inviting her, or warning her. Vines crawled up the stone facade, clinging like desperate fingers. Windows, broken in patches, reflected slivers of the gray sky. The front door leaned slightly to the left, as though exhausted by years of waiting, but Maggie saw beauty in decay. She always had. She ran her hand along the wood frame, feeling the splinters, the coldness, the whisper of a life this house once had. And for the first time in years, she felt something loosen in her chest. A breath. A beginning. Inside, the air smelled of mildew, tobacco that had seeped into the walls, and something older, something like time itself gathering dust. Floorboards groaned under her steps, not in warning, but in recognition, as if the house was remembering what it felt like to hold a human presence again. Maggie dropped her bags, exhaled, and whispered to the silence, "I guess it's just you and me now." She didn't know the house would one day answer back. The first days inside the mansion unfolded slowly, like pages of a book. Maggie wasn't sure she was ready to read, but couldn't bring herself to close. There was a tenderness in the quiet routine she began to create, small gestures of reclaiming space, of making something abandoned feel once again touched by human hands. Each morning she opened the curtains, though most were torn or stiff from years of disuse. Pale autumn light filtered through the dusty fabric, spilling across the faded parquet floors in long, amber strokes. The air shimmered with motes that drifted like tiny ghosts, rising and falling in the soft drafts that slipped through the broken window frames. Maggie swept, always gently. She hummed sometimes, not realizing she did. A slow, fragile song her mother used to sing. The bristles moved across the floor in steady arcs, revealing wood patterns hidden under decades of grime. Every time the mansion revealed a layer of itself, Maggie felt something inside her do the same. She found small things, buttons, coins, a silver cufflink with the initials AR. She placed them carefully into a ceramic bowl she found in a kitchen drawer, as if these remnants were clues in a story she had not yet been told. She handled everything like it was alive. In the afternoons, she sat on the front steps with a cup of tea, letting the cold wind brush against her cheeks while she watched leaves gather in little amber drifts. Redwood Falls was quiet, in a way that felt intentional, as though the town understood suffering and believed in giving space to those who carried it. Neighbors didn't come to greet her. They watched from afar, curious, cautious. Some slowed their cars near the driveway, others stood at the corner where the road bent and pretended to check their phones. No one approached, except one. Nina Coleman, the owner of the local bookstore, a small shop nestled between the diner and an antique store, appeared on Maggie's second afternoon. She brought cinnamon bread wrapped in brown paper and a smile too warm for October. "You'll want this," she'd said, handing over the parcel. "The nights get cold up here. And that house, well, it makes them feel colder." Maggie invited her inside, embarrassed by the state of the place, but Nina didn't seem to mind. She walked through the entrance hall with slow steps, eyes moving as though reading invisible lines left behind by past lives. "My grandmother used to talk about this place," Nina said quietly, "before everything went wrong." Maggie didn't ask what wrong meant. She sensed it was not a story meant for early conversations. Grief had taught her the timing of silence. But she noticed something in Nina's voice, an undercurrent of fear, not about the house itself, but about its memory. Later that night, after Nina left, Maggie sat at the old dining table, writing in her notebook the way she always did when something unsettled her. Her handwriting was slow and deliberate, shaped by years of teaching children how to form their letters with care. Entry, October 11th. The house breathes differently at night. The walls expand with the cold. The floors whisper beneath the wind. I don't feel afraid, just watched, in the way a memory watches. She closed the notebook gently, the same way she closed everything in her life since Thomas died, careful not to disturb whatever fragile peace she had managed to build. The next morning brought a crisp sky washed in pale blue, the kind of cold brightness that makes everything feel sharper. Maggie decided to explore more of the mansion, not just clean it. She wanted to understand it, restore it, piece by piece. She began upstairs. The wooden banister was still sturdy despite its age, the railing smooth from hands that had once slid down its length. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before her, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward, listening. She opened each room slowly. The first had peeling wallpaper patterned with faded roses. A broken crib leaned against the far wall. She felt a sting in her chest and closed the door softly. The second room held nothing but a rusted typewriter on the floor, its key stiff and stubborn, the ribbon brittle. The third was locked. She jiggled the handle, pushed lightly, then harder. It didn't budge. She frowned, not because of the lock itself, but because something about the door felt off. The frame didn't align perfectly. The hinges were newer than the rest of the house. And when she pressed her palm against the wood, she felt a faint vibration, like a humming buried deep inside the walls. But she stepped back, told herself it was just old pipes, just the house adjusting, just her imagination. She walked away. Downstairs, the kitchen was lit by slanted beams of sunlight that revealed streaks of dust like scratches across the air. She opened cabinets, discovering old jars and faded recipe cards left behind by someone who must have once loved to cook. One card caught her eye. Sunday Gravy, Romano family. She didn't know yet that the name on the card was not just a coincidence. By late afternoon, Maggie decided to rest. She sat near the fireplace, a blanket around her shoulders. The flames crackled softly, releasing the smell of burning cedar. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth seep into her bones. And that was when she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a tap. Then another, coming from inside the wall behind the fireplace. She froze, held her breath, but the sound stopped, and silence settled again, thick as wool. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. Houses made noises, old walls shifted, pipes groaned. She knew these explanations, understood them, but something about the sound stayed with her, echoed in her ribs. She opened her notebook again. Entry, October 12th. Something behind the fireplace, a sound like knuckles, soft, careful, as if it didn't want to be heard, but I heard it. I'm sure I did. When she closed the notebook this time, her hands trembled just slightly. The next day, Maggie pretended the sound had never happened. She woke up early, as she always did, making tea in a chipped mug she'd brought from her old house, one of the few objects that had traveled with her through every version of her life. Steam rose in delicate curls, fogging the small kitchen window as the sky shifted from indigo to pale gray. The house felt heavy, the way old blankets feel when soaked with rain. She told herself it was nothing, just the settling of wood, the tired sigh of a house adjusting to a new season, to a new presence. She swept the floors, she aired the rooms, she hummed without realizing it. But by afternoon, the thought of that sound, those faint, careful taps, had woven itself into the edges of her mind, returning in soft flashes every time a floorboard groaned or the wind brushed against the windows. By the second evening, she found herself glancing more often toward the fireplace. It dominated the living room, a massive stone structure with a soot-darkened mouth and a mantel carved in intricate patterns of leaves and grapes, the kind of craftsmanship no one paid for anymore. Above it the wall was bare, no painting, no mirror, just clean faded plaster, too clean, too smooth. She tried not to notice how the plaster near the right side of the fireplace looked slightly newer than the rest of the wall, how the lines in the stone didn't quite match where they met the frame, how the air near that section felt colder. That night the sound came again. She was half asleep in the old leather armchair by the fire, a book open but unread in her lap, when she heard it. Soft, deliberate, unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Her eyes opened slowly. The fire had burned low, embers glowing like watchful eyes. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching and shrinking with each flicker. The sound was faint, but now that she was listening for it, it seemed to echo inside her skull, rather than in the room. Tap. Then silence. She sat very still, her breath shallow and slow. Fear didn't arrive all at once. It crept in like cold, seeping through a thin blanket, finding every gap, every vulnerability. Eventually she stood, joints stiff, and stepped closer to the fireplace. The stones felt cool beneath her bare feet. She reached out and pressed her hand against the wall beside the mantel. The plaster was cold. Colder than it should have been. Pipes, she whispered to herself. Old pipes, maybe animals. She wanted to believe it. She almost did. She withdrew her hand and turned away, reminding herself of all the rational explanations she had given other people during a lifetime of teaching children to separate stories from reality. But as she walked to her bedroom, the feeling that she was walking away from something rather than past it followed her down the hall. That night, sleep came in fragments. She dreamed of knocking, of someone standing on the other side of a wall, their voice muffled and distant. She woke with the taste of dust on her tongue and the strange certainty that if she pressed her ear to the plaster, she would hear breathing. On the fourth day, the animals noticed. Maggie had always trusted animals more than she trusted people. They didn't lie. They didn't pretend. They simply responded to what was there, seen and unseen. She noticed them first from the window above the sink. A small family of deer appeared near the tree line, moving cautiously through the washed-out yellow of the tall grass. One of the younger ones, its coat still patchy in places, took a few brave steps closer to the clearing around the house. It stopped abruptly. Its ears flicked forward. Its body went rigid. Then, as if hearing something she could not, it turned sharply and bolted back toward the trees. The others followed, hooves thudding against the ground, disappearing into the shadows. Later that afternoon, a stray dog wandered up the drive, a skinny brown mutt with bright, hopeful eyes. Maggie knelt, hand outstretched, calling to it softly. The dog wagged its tail, took a few hesitant steps toward her, and then froze, nose lifting to sniff the air. Its gaze shifted past her shoulder to the house. Every part of the dog changed at once. Its tail dropped, its ears flattened. A low whine escaped its throat as it began to back away, step by careful step, eyes never leaving the dark rectangle of the open front door. Then it turned and ran, yelping once, as if scolded. Maggie watched it go, a strange chill crawling up her spine. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe the dog had caught the scent of something, old rot, mold, the residue of wild animals that had crept inside. But the moment stayed with her. That evening she wrote in her notebook again. Entry October 14th. The deer wouldn't cross the clearing. The dog wouldn't enter the house. Animals don't understand stories, but they understand danger. I keep telling myself there's nothing here, but the house keeps insisting there is. Redwood Falls remained distant. Maggie went into town twice during that first week, once for groceries, once to find a hardware store. Each time she felt eyes on her back as soon as she mentioned the Romano estate. At the grocery store, the cashier paused when she heard Maggie's address. "You're staying up there?" she asked, scanning the items more slowly now. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a washed-out glow over everything. "Yes," Maggie replied, managing a small smile. "It's a lot of work, but it has potential." The cashier didn't smile back. "My dad used to say some places hold on too tight to what happened in them. Said that house was one of them." Maggie swallowed. "Because of the Romano family?" The cashier didn't answer immediately. She finished scanning the last item, printed the receipt, and then looked up with eyes that suddenly seemed older. "Because of what people did there," she said softly, "and what they let happen." On her way out, Maggie saw a bulletin board near the exit, local ads, missing cat posters, church announcements. One flyer was half torn, its paper yellowed and curling at the edges. It showed the black and white face of a boy, his solemn eyes staring straight ahead. At the top, faded but still legible, "Missing, 1976." She didn't know why the date made her chest tighten. On her second trip into town, she found Mercer Hardware, a narrow store that smelled of oil and metal and old wood. Behind the counter stood Sheriff Daniel Mercer himself, wearing a worn jacket over a tan uniform shirt, his badge slightly dulled with age. "You're the new owner up at the Romano place," he said, without introduction, as she set a bundle of nails, a hammer, and a flashlight on the counter. "Yes," she answered, surprised he knew. "I'm Maggie Hale." His gaze studied her face for a moment too long, as if searching for something. Weakness, stubbornness, maybe the kind of fear that would make her leave. "Are you living there alone?" he asked. "I am." He nodded slowly, then leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough that it felt like a confidence, though the words did not carry comfort. "Old houses make a lot of noise, especially that one," he said. "Best thing you can do is ignore it. Don't go digging into walls and floorboards trying to fix what doesn't need fixing." There was something in his tone, an edge beneath the casual advice. Maggie felt her throat go dry. "I just want to make it livable," she replied. "Safe." "Some places don't get safer just because you poke around their bones," Mercer said. Then he straightened, rang up the items, and added, in a voice back to normal, "That'll be $38.50. On the drive back, the trees along the road seemed to lean closer to the car, their branches interlocking above her like dark fingers, creating a tunnel of rustling shadows. She couldn't shake the feeling that the sheriff's warning wasn't about her safety at all. It was about the house, or what the house contained. By the end of the first week, her rationalizations began to crack. The sounds grew bolder. It was no longer just soft tapping behind the fireplace. Now, some nights, she heard something that sounded like shuffling or dragging from somewhere between the walls. Once, while in the hallway, she could have sworn she heard a faint scratchy noise beneath the floorboards, like a record player stuck on a damaged groove. The house seemed to respond to her presence more actively, its creaks and sighs timed with her steps, with her breath. The wind whistled differently when it passed the northern wall. Doors she knew she had left open were found closed in the morning. The temperature dropped sharply in certain rooms, as if pockets of air had decided to stay loyal to another time. She told herself each event had a reasonable explanation. Old houses shifted, old locks slipped, drafts were unpredictable. But one evening, as she walked past the fireplace on her way to the kitchen, the overhead light flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The house plunged into darkness, so sudden and complete it felt almost intentional. For a moment, all she could hear was her own breathing and the faint tick of the old clock in the hallway. Then, from behind the fireplace wall, she heard it again. Tap, 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 tap. This time faster, more insistent. Her heart pounded. She stood frozen, fingers digging into the cool wood of the doorway, until muscle memory, and perhaps a deeper instinct, forced her to move toward the drawer where she kept a small flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, harsh and narrow. Dust motes glittered like tiny shards suspended in the air. She walked back to the fireplace, the circle of light shaking just slightly in her hand. The wall looked the same, pale plaster, a faint hairline crack near the top, no openings, no seams. Nothing to suggest there was anything beyond it but insulation and brick. Yet as she brought her face closer to the cold surface, she felt it, just for a second, a vibration. The faintest hint of something moving behind the wall, and under everything else, buried in the layers of old tobacco and mildew and dust, another smell surfaced, something metallic, like rust, like blood left to age on concrete. She recoiled, heart thudding against her ribs. Later, sitting at the dining table, her notebook open, She stared at the blank page for a long time before she began to write. Entry: October 18th. The lights went out tonight. The house went utterly dark, as if someone had cut the cord between it and the world. Then came the knocking. It's not pipes. It's not the wind. It feels deliberate, like someone trapped on the wrong side of time, asking if I'm finally ready to listen. She closed the notebook, but this time she did not feel peace. She felt watched. At the start of the second week, Nina came by again. She brought another loaf of bread, this time pumpkin, and a box of old candles she said she didn't trust herself with, making a joke about almost burning down her bookstore once. But her laugh was thin, and her eyes lingered on the fireplace longer than before. "Have you heard anything?" Nina asked suddenly, as they stood in the living room. Maggie's chest tightened. "Heard anything?" Nina hesitated. "My grandmother used to say the walls in this house never learned how to forget. People reported sounds, knocks, voices. Some said it was the ghosts of people who got mixed up with the Romanos. Others said it was guilt." "Do you believe in ghosts?" Maggie asked. Nina shook her head, then nodded, then shrugged. "I believe in things we don't understand yet. I believe in the way places hold stories, especially when nobody tells them out loud." Maggie followed her gaze to the fireplace. The candlelight from the nearby console table flickered, throwing soft, trembling shadows against the plaster. Nina lowered her voice. "If you ever find anything in this house, old papers, tapes, records, anything, promise me you won't just throw it away." "Why?" Maggie asked. "Because people went missing in this town," Nina said quietly, "and not all of them were running." The words sank into the silence like stones. Hours later, when the house had swallowed Nina's footsteps and Maggie was alone again, she stood in front of the fireplace with a different kind of awareness. For the first time, she didn't just see a wall. She saw a boundary between what the town allowed itself to remember and what it had decided to bury. That night, when the tapping started again, she didn't walk away. She placed her hand on the cold plaster and whispered, barely audible even to herself, "I hear you." The tapping stopped. Not abruptly, not angrily, but slowly, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side had finally been acknowledged and was now waiting for her to decide whether she would ignore it like everyone else had, or start to investigate what the house had been trying all along to say. The morning after she whispered to the wall felt different from every day before it. The house seemed quieter, not calm, but expectant, like a stage moments before the curtain rises. Maggie felt it the moment she opened her eyes, the way one feels a shift in weather before stepping outside. The air was heavier, cooler. A strange stillness pressed gently against her skin. She dressed slowly, wool sweater, faded jeans, and moved through the house with the cautious curiosity of someone walking through someone else's memory. The tapping had not returned during the night, yet the silence it left behind carried more meaning than the sound itself. It wasn't absence. It was anticipation. By noon, she found herself standing once again before the fireplace. The plaster looked the same, smooth, pale, slightly uneven in places, but now that she knew where to look, she noticed details she had missed, faint, linear inconsistencies in the texture. A tiny ridge near the top corner, a feather-thin crack running vertically just left of the mantel. She traced a finger along the crack. The plaster flaked under her touch, revealing a sliver of darker material beneath, a shade of gray that didn't match the rest of the wall. She stepped back. Her breath slowed. It wasn't what she touched that unnerved her. It was what she felt. A faint vibration, steady and rhythmic, like the echo of a heartbeat, long buried but refusing to die. For a moment she considered walking away, pretending she felt nothing. But pretending had never saved her from grief. It would not save her from truth now. She needed help. Redwood Falls's public library sat in a brick building near the town square, with ivy crawling up its sides and large windows that trapped the afternoon light like amber. Maggie had always loved libraries, the quiet reverence, the smell of old paper, the way knowledge hums softly in the air like an ancient hymn. It was Nina who suggested she visit. "Talk to Ethan Morrow," Nina had said. "If there's something strange about the architecture in that place, he'll know. He knows every building in this town better than the people who live in them." Maggie found Ethan in a back corner of the library, surrounded by towers of books, most of them old enough to crumble if handled without care. He was in his mid-30s, with tired eyes and a cautious nature, as if he lived half in the present and half in some decade he couldn't quite let go of. When Maggie introduced herself, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or worry. "You're living in the Romano estate," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a fact loaded with history. "I am," she answered. "I think there's something behind the fireplace." Ethan didn't react with disbelief. He didn't smile or laugh or dismiss her words. Instead, he lowered the book he was holding and leaned slightly closer. "What kind of something?" She hesitated. "A hidden space, maybe. Or a sealed room. I keep hearing tapping." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Ethan stood. "I need to show you something," he said. He led her through the archives section to a locked cabinet at the back of the room. From it he pulled an old blueprint tube, yellowed with age. When he unrolled the paper on the table, Maggie felt the breath leave her lungs. It was the blueprint of her mansion, but not the one she recognized. "This is from 1926, Ethan said. "Before the renovations the Romanos did, before the additions, before the hidden spaces." The blueprint showed the main floor, the living room, the dining room, the library, the kitchen. But there was something else, something Maggie had never seen. Behind the fireplace was a room, a small square room. No door, no windows, no entry point. It was simply labeled storage? Restricted? Her skin prickled. Why would they build a room with no entrance? Ethan swallowed. Because it wasn't meant to be accessed by the owners, only by the ones who built it. She looked up sharply. "The Romanos?" Ethan shook his head. "No, the builders they hired, the men who came from out of town, the ones nobody could identify, the ones who left every night in black cars and never spoke to anyone here." Maggie felt her blood run cold. Ethan pulled another sheet from the tube, this one more damaged, corners torn. The ink faded into reddish-brown patches. It looked like it had survived a fire. "This," Ethan said, "was found in the basement of the town hall 30 years ago. Nobody claimed it." He unrolled it carefully. It was a partial layout of the same room. But this time, the label was different. Different handwriting, different ink. It read, "Holding." A chill spread across her spine. Ethan lowered his voice. "When I was a kid, my uncle used to tell stories about that house, about people who entered and never came back, about deals made behind those walls, about children who went missing in the 70s. Maggie's breath caught. "I saw a flyer in the grocery store. A boy. Missing since 1976. Ethan nodded. "There were more, and every rumor that ever existed leads back to that house." She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. "I need to see inside," she said. Ethan hesitated. "If that room is still there, it won't be easy. They would have sealed it with layers, concrete, plaster, maybe reinforced steel. It wasn't meant to be found." "But it was meant to be heard," Maggie whispered. The look Ethan gave her then was not skepticism. It was fear. When they reached the mansion that afternoon, clouds had gathered thick and low over Redwood Falls, the sky the color of bruised metal. Wind pressed through the trees with a restless urgency, rattling branches like bones. Ethan walked into the house slowly, turning in small circles as he took it all in. Maggie watched him study the molding, the ceiling beams, the alignment of the floorboards near the fireplace. This house was altered, he said softly, manipulated, hidden on purpose. He stepped closer to the fireplace, but before he touched the wall, he paused. You felt vibration here? Maggie nodded, and tapping, as if something was inside. Ethan pressed his fingertips carefully against the plaster. His eyes narrowed. It's hollow, he said. The space is still there. Maggie's breath caught. Then why hasn't anyone found it before? Ethan stepped back, staring at the wall as if listening to something only he could hear. Because someone didn't want it found. Lightning flashed outside, and for a fraction of a second the room glowed white, the shadows behind the mantel stretching long and strange across the floor. Thunder rolled in the distance. Ethan exhaled slowly. We're going to need tools, a thermal scanner, sound mapping, maybe even a structural camera. I have a flashlight and a hammer, Maggie said quietly. He turned to her, his expression softening. That's enough for tonight, he said. But whatever is behind that wall isn't just part of this house's history. He looked back at the fireplace. It's part of this town's history, a part they buried, a part they hoped no one would ever uncover again. A gust of wind slammed against the side of the house, making the old glass rattle. Maggie stood very still. For the first time since moving in, she felt something new, not dread, not curiosity, purpose. Something had been waiting in this house for decades, waiting for someone who wouldn't run. And Maggie Hale, the quiet widow who had come here to escape her past, realized she had stepped into something far greater than a renovation project. She had stepped into a truth no one else had dared to face. The next day, Redwood Falls woke beneath a sky the color of wet concrete. Rain clung to the air without quite falling, suspended in a damp haze that made every surface shine faintly. Maggie could feel the weather in her joints and the small ache that settled at the base of her spine as she moved through the house, but she didn't complain. Pain, she had learned, was easier to manage when you had something to move toward. Ethan arrived mid-morning carrying a worn backpack and a toolbox that looked older than he was. He stepped into the mansion, pushing the front door closed behind him with a firm hand, and the house answered his presence with a long, low creak that ran up the walls like a shiver. You brought a lot, Maggie said, half teasing, half grateful. I brought very little, he answered. For something like this. He set the toolbox down near the fireplace and unzipped his backpack. Inside, Maggie saw a small handheld thermal scanner, a compact audio recorder, and a narrow, flexible inspection camera, its cord coiled neatly like a sleeping snake. Borrowed most of it, he said, noticing her stare. From a contractor who owes me more than a few favors. Don't worry, I didn't tell him why. Do you always investigate old houses, Maggie asked, or just the ones the whole town pretends not to remember? Ethan gave a brief, humorless smile. Just the ones that keep showing up in the missing persons files. The words hung in the air like mist. He started with the thermal scanner, moving it slowly across the wall above and beside the fireplace. The small screen glowed in shades of blue and green, occasionally flickering with warmer hues. Maggie watched, arms folded, trying not to breathe too loudly. There, Ethan murmured, stopping. On the screen, a rectangular shape appeared behind the plaster, cooler than its surroundings, sharply defined. Not pipes, not studs. An enclosed space, he said. The temperature difference makes sense if it's sealed off. He traced the outline with the scanner, revealing the dimensions of a room no larger than a walk-in closet. Maggie felt her heart beat faster, the pulse pressing against the inside of her skin. Is it empty? She asked. Ethan hesitated. Temperatures like this could mean it hasn't been exposed to airflow for a long time. But that doesn't tell us what's inside. He set the scanner aside and picked up the inspection camera. This will, he said softly. They marked a small circle on the plaster, near where the thermal reading indicated the upper corner of the hidden space. Ethan drilled slowly, carefully, the whine of the bit loud and jarring in the quiet room. White dust puffed from the hole, mingling with the smell of old plaster and something else, something stale, something that hadn't breathed in decades. When the drill broke through, the sound changed, less resistance, more hollowness. Ethan switched it off. The silence afterward was almost violent. "Ready?" he asked. Maggie nodded, though every part of her body said she wasn't. He fed the flexible camera through the small opening, its thin body disappearing into the wall. On a handheld screen attached by cable, shapes began to appear, blurry at first, then sharpening as he adjusted the focus. Maggie leaned in. The first thing they saw was dust, thick, undisturbed, lying like gray snow over everything. The second was a wall closer than she expected, painted in a dark, faded color. Then the camera panned downward, shelves, sturdy wooden shelves built into the wall, now draped in dust. On them, shapes, boxes, tins, something cylindrical. Ethan inched the camera lower, moving slowly, carefully. "Are those cans?" Maggie whispered. "No, not cans. Reels. Film reels, some rusted, some still intact, stacked in sloppy towers. Beside them, in neatly lined rows, were tapes, cassette tapes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds." Maggie's mouth went dry. "Recordings?" Ethan swallowed. Of what? The question wasn't rhetorical. It trembled in the air between them. He shifted the camera again. In the far corner of the small space, the light of the camera's tiny LED caught something else, metal gleaming faintly beneath the dust. A box, a safe, maybe. Or a container bolted to the floor. Then the angle revealed something that made both of them go still. On the back wall, barely visible through the haze, were papers tacked in imperfect lines, some curled at the edges, some half fallen. The camera moved closer, the focus adjusting, until the first one came into view fully. It was a photograph, a face, a boy, maybe 12, staring at the camera with eyes too serious for his age. Maggie recognized him, the faded grocery store flyer, the date, 1976. Her breath hitched. "Oh my God!" Ethan didn't look at her. His jaw tightened as he guided the camera along the row. More photos appeared one by one. Girls, boys, young faces captured in flat, unforgiving black and white. Some had names written beneath them, scrawled in uneven handwriting. Others were labeled only with dates. "Missing," Ethan whispered. "These are the kids who disappeared. Not all of them, but some of them." His hand shook. Maggie reached for the wall to steady herself. "They knew," she said. "Whoever used this room, they kept these, like trophies. Or records," she thought. Or proof. Her mind flickered back to the sheriff's warning. Don't go digging. Don't open what doesn't need to be opened. She understood now that his concern had never been structural stability. It had been silence. "What do we do with this?" she asked. Ethan withdrew the camera, coiling the cord slowly, as if giving himself time to think. "This isn't just a secret room in an old house," he said. "This might be evidence. Of what was done, of who was taken, of who knew and kept it hidden." "You mean the Romanos," she said. He met her gaze, eyes shadowed. "And maybe not just them." They sat at the dining table, the weight of the discovery pressing against their shoulders like an invisible hand. The light outside had dimmed into a dull afternoon gray, and the house seemed to listen, every creak and sigh amplified. "If we call the sheriff," Maggie said slowly, "will he help?" Ethan's jaw flexed. He might pretend to, long enough to decide what can still be buried. "You think he's involved?" "I think his family was here in the 70s. I think his father was sheriff before him. I think this town has a long history of calling crimes misunderstandings and looking the other way." Maggie rested her hands flat on the table, palms against the old wood. They felt unsteady, like they didn't quite belong to her. "Then who do we call?" she asked. Ethan looked at the notebook beside her. its pages filled with careful handwriting, meticulous entries. "You document everything," he said. "You've been writing since you moved in, haven't you?" She nodded. "Then we start there," he continued. "We make a record of what we found, the thermal scans, the footage from the camera. We make copies. We don't keep everything in one place, and when we have enough that can't be dismissed as an old woman's imagination," he paused, "we take it above the sheriff, state authorities, maybe even federal. Something like this, with missing kids tied to organized crime, it doesn't stay small if we put it into the right hands." "If," Maggie repeated, "if we get the chance." A gust of wind rattled the windows, and the house answered with a groan deep in its bones. She felt the sound in her chest. "What if," she said quietly, "this is exactly why the house called me here?" Ethan frowned. "You think the house chose you?" "It sounds ridiculous, I know," she replied. "But I keep thinking about the price. $100. Why so low? Why release this place now? After all these years, why not sell it to someone in town who would know better than to look too close?" She thought of the woman at the clerk's office. "I hope you're someone who believes in the truth." "It feels like I was sent here for a reason," Maggie said. "Or, at least, that I'm the first one in a long time who listened when it knocked." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the fireplace, his eyes distant. "My aunt," he said slowly, "had a little brother. He disappeared in 1976. She always believed someone in this town knew what happened, but nobody talked. Nobody admitted anything. The last place he was seen was near this hill." Maggie turned her head sharply. "Your family?" He nodded once. "His face is on that grocery store flyer. It's been on that board longer than I've been alive." The realization settled between them like ash. "You're not just helping me," Maggie said softly. "You're looking for him." His voice was rough when he answered. "I grew up being told not to ask questions. Not about that year, not about this house. But now we have more than rumors. We have proof there's something here, a room they hid, with photos they collected, like they were cataloging their own sins." He met her eyes. "I'm done being quiet." So was she. The first real crack in the town's silence came that evening, not from an authority or an official report, but from a conversation held under the dim, buzzing lights of Nina's bookstore. Nina locked the door early when Maggie and Ethan arrived, turning the sign to "closed" despite the remaining sliver of daylight outside. The shop smelled of paper and cinnamon, a comfort that clashed with the weight of what they brought with them. Maggie showed Nina the footage from the inspection camera. Nina watched in silence, hands clasped tightly in front of her, fingers pressing into her own knuckles. When the first photograph appeared on the screen, Nina's breath hitched. She reached out, touching the edge of the small monitor, as if she could touch the face inside it. "Is that," she began, voice breaking, "is that Tommy Geller?" Ethan nodded. "You knew him?" "We were in the same class," Nina whispered. "He disappeared after Halloween. They said he'd run away. That his parents were too strict, but he never said he wanted to leave. He just vanished?" Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked away, angrily. "We were kids," she said. "They told us not to talk about it, not to scare the younger ones. They said it was a tragedy, not a crime, that we needed to move on." She looked from the screen to Maggie, then to Ethan. "Tell me that's in your house," she said. "Tell me that's where you filmed this." "It is," Maggie answered. "Behind the fireplace. A sealed room. We haven't opened it yet." Nina exhaled slowly, as if some part of her had always known this. "My grandmother used to say the Romanos didn't just bring money into this town. They brought darkness. But nobody wanted to lose what they brought with them, so people learned how to close their eyes." "Not everyone," Maggie said gently. Nina shook her head. "No, some of us just weren't old enough to be listened to." She wiped a stray tear with the heel of her hand, then straightened. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Maggie hesitated. to know if we're crazy, if we're reading too much into this, if we should stop. Nina's laugh was short and sharp. You found a hidden room full of tapes and photos of missing kids tied to a crime family, she said. If anything, you're not reading enough into it. She stepped closer. I can help you dig, she said. Not in the walls, not yet, but in the past. Old newspapers, church bulletins, obituaries, whispers between the lines. If that room is what we think it is, then somewhere someone tried to talk about it and got drowned out. The three of them exchanged a look that felt like an agreement, a pact. It was no longer just a widow and a historian listening to a haunted house. It was a small, fragile coalition against decades of silence. Back at the mansion that night, as Maggie climbed the stairs alone, the house felt different again. It no longer felt like a predator waiting in the dark. It felt like a witness that had waited far too long for someone to finally open its mouth and let the truth spill out. As she passed the fireplace, she paused, resting her hand on the cool plaster. "We saw what you've been hiding," she murmured. "We're not going to look away." The house creaked in response, a low, resonant sound that echoed through the beams and floorboards. Not threatening, not welcoming, just relieved. She went to bed knowing that the next step would require more than cameras and scanners. It would require breaking through, and once they broke that wall, nothing in Redwood Falls would ever be the same again. The morning they decided to break through the wall arrived with unsettling calm. No rain, no wind, no birdsong, just a pale, muted sky, the color of ash water stretching over Redwood Falls like a held breath. Maggie felt it the moment she opened her eyes, a tension threaded through the air, thin and taut, like the house itself bracing for something long overdue. Ethan came early, carrying heavier tools this time, a crowbar, a sledgehammer with a worn handle, a pry bar, dust masks, gloves thick enough to grip broken plaster. Nina followed half an hour later with a thermos of coffee and a solemn quiet that made her seem older than she was. None of them spoke at first. They stood before the fireplace in a soft half-circle, like mourners at a grave they were about to exhume. The faint light filtering in through the grimy windows settled in slow, drifting sheets of dust, illuminating the wall where the secret pulsed behind 30 years of silence. Maggie's hands shook despite her resolve. The wall felt colder today, colder than stone, colder than winter, as if whatever lay inside had stopped pretending to sleep. Ethan adjusted his gloves and exhaled. "Once we start, there's no undoing this." The room held still. Even the house seemed to listen. "Then we start," Maggie said quietly. Ethan lifted the sledgehammer. The motion seemed impossibly slow, deliberate, a kind of reverence in the way he raised it above his shoulder. He hesitated only once, and then the hammer came down. The sound shattered the silence, a deep, resonant thud, followed by a vibration through the floorboards that the house absorbed with an almost weary sigh. Plaster sprayed outward, brittle shards scattering like bone fragments. Ethan swung again and again. Each impact echoed through the mansion, striking old beams, stirring old dust, waking old ghosts. A gash opened across the plaster, long, jagged, splitting downward like a wound finally tearing open. Behind it, they saw darkness, heavy, unbreathing, undisturbed. Ethan set the hammer aside and switched to the pry bar, driving it into the split. The wall groaned as the first panel broke loose, crumbling away to reveal the hidden room's true face. A thick wave of air rushed out. Stale, suffocating, metallic, the smell of rusted time and old secrets that had fermented in the dark. Maggie gagged behind her mask. Nina turned her head and pressed her sleeve to her nose. Ethan pointed his flashlight through the opening. Inside, the beam cut through swirling dust, illuminating a small square chamber sealed for decades. No windows, no door. No natural light. Just walls the color of aged parchment, plaster flaking like dead skin. The shelves were exactly as the camera had shown, but in person they felt different, heavier, more sinister. Film reels sat in sagging stacks, some banded loosely with rotted string. Rows of cassette tapes occupied the lower shelves, their labels faded, some handwritten, some typed. And on the far wall, held by rusted nails, the photographs stared back at them. Children, dozens of them. Their young faces faded, but still clear enough to see the fear in some, the confusion in others. Black and white ghosts trapped in a room that had never been meant for sunlight. Nina's knees nearly buckled. She inched forward, whispering the names she recognized. "That's Tommy, and Catherine Boyd, and Marcus Teal. My God, that's Sarah Haynes." Her voice broke completely. Ethan steadied her, but his own face had turned ashen. "This is evidence," he said. "All of it. Every single piece." Maggie stepped inside. It felt like crossing into a different decade, the air thick, unmoving, clinging to her skin. Her flashlight trembled in her hand as she scanned the room. On the floor near the metal safe-like box she'd glimpsed earlier, she noticed something small, something out of place. A shoe, a child's shoe, brown leather, untied lace, still covered in dust, but unmistakably real. Maggie's breath shuddered out of her lungs. She knelt, reaching toward it, but stopped short, her fingers hovering inches above the relic. A whisper of memory drifted through her mind. The flyer at the grocery store. Ethan crouched beside her. "It's a boy's size. Maybe 10. Her throat tightened. "They kept things, objects, pieces of them," Nina whispered from behind. "They kept proof." The words were true, but they tasted bitter. Ethan moved toward the metal box in the corner. It was bolted into the concrete floor, edges sealed with rust thick as scabs. He ran his gloved fingers across the lid. "Locked," he said. "We'll need tools, real ones." "What do you think is inside?" Maggie asked. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Documents, money, evidence. Something they couldn't risk burning. Something the Romanos, or the ones who came after, wanted hidden. As they examined the contents of the shelves, Maggie noticed a small cassette tape that stood out from the others. Its label wasn't handwritten or typed. It was etched, scratched into the plastic itself in uneven letters, "Play Me." Her heart slammed painfully once, a single heavy beat. She picked it up just as Ethan and Nina turned toward her. Their eyes landed on the tape, and silence rippled across the room. "That's not an index marker," Ethan said. "That's a message." Maggie nodded slowly. "To someone who'd eventually find it," Ethan swallowed, "or to someone they knew would come looking." Nina stepped closer, her breath uneven. Maybe the person who made that tape was trying to expose the others. The three of them stared at the tape. Its plastic was cold in Maggie's hand, colder than anything else in the room. She turned it over slowly, noticing the faint remnants of fingerprints pressed into the dust, children's names, tape reels, a locked box. A message scratched into plastic. This was no mere storage room. This was a confession sealed inside stone. "Maggie," Ethan said, his voice low, "this could break everything open, not just the Romanos, the town, the sheriff, everyone who knew." Maggie held the tape to her chest, gripping it as if it were a fragile heartbeat. Just then the house shivered, not a creak or a settling beam. A deep, resonant tremor, as if something massive had shifted in its foundation. Dust rained from the ceiling. A crack zigzagged down the opposite wall. Ethan stood quickly. "We need to get out. This room's been sealed for decades. Breaking it open changed the pressure. It's not safe." Nina backed toward the door, hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide. Maggie stepped out last, pausing at the threshold for one final look. The children's faces watched her, silent, waiting, pleading. "Don't worry," she whispered. "We won't leave you here." The house groaned once more, long and low, like an exhale it had been holding for half a lifetime. As they sealed the opening temporarily and stepped into the hallway, Something heavy shifted inside Maggie's chest. Not fear, not even sorrow. Resolve. For the first time in 6 years, since the day her husband died, she knew exactly what she was meant to do. The truth had chosen her, and she would carry it out of the dark, no matter who tried to stop her. They didn't sleep that night. The house felt different now, not just awakened, but unsettled. Its silence was too sharp, too aware, like the pause between a held breath and a scream. Maggie sat at the dining table with Ethan and Nina, the cassette tape between them, a small black rectangle of plastic that pulsed with more danger than anything they had ever touched. The tape seemed to throb in the low lamplight, almost alive. "We can't play it here," Ethan said. If someone shows up?" Nina nodded. "And we don't know what's on it, if it's violent." Maggie stared at the label again. "Play me," not written, etched, scratched in desperation by a hand that knew it had one chance to speak. "We'll play it tomorrow," Maggie said softly, "at Nina's shop, the back room." Ethan and Nina exchanged a look, agreement mixed with fear. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing against the windows like fingertips. The house creaked once, sharply, as if insisting they pay attention. It was almost midnight when they finally left. Ethan walked Nina to her car first, then returned to Maggie at the front steps. The moonlight was thin, casting pale silver over the porch and making the vines crawl like black veins across the stone. "Lock your door," he said, "and don't answer if someone knocks." She gave a tired smile. "I'll be fine. I've been alone a long time." "This isn't the kind of alone that's safe," he whispered. He hesitated before leaving, glancing back at the dark windows. The house watched him go. At 7:12 the next morning, someone knocked on Maggie's door, not gently, not politely, but with 3 heavy, deliberate strikes that rattled the frame. Maggie froze, coffee cup halfway to her lips. Ethan wouldn't knock like that, she thought. Nina wouldn't either. The knocks came again, harder. She set the cup down slowly, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. The air inside the house felt cold, heavy, thick as river fog. She moved toward the door, each step measured, the floorboards groaning beneath her as if warning her to stop. She opened the door a crack. Sheriff Daniel Mercer stood on her porch, hat on, jacket zipped, badge gleaming, his expression unreadable, but his eyes cold, sharp, calculating. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," he said, tipping his head. "Mind if I come in?" Her pulse spiked. Her hand tightened on the door. "Is something wrong?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Mercer offered a thin smile. "A few folks in town mentioned seeing your lights on late. Lots of activity. Thought I'd check in, make sure everything's all right." The emphasis didn't feel casual. Behind him, 2 Black County vehicles were parked on the road, engines idling, men inside, watching. Maggie felt the house tighten around her like a held breath. "I'm fine," she said, "just settling in." Mercer's eyes drifted past her shoulder into the dim hallway. "You sure?" he asked. "We've had reports of squatters in that property before. Strange noises? Thought maybe you were having disturbances." The word lodged like a splinter. "No disturbances," Maggie said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. Mercer stepped closer, too close. "You hear anything unusual these past days?" A beat of silence. The house seemed to hold itself perfectly still. Maggie met his eyes. "No," she said. "Nothing unusual." For 3 long seconds he stared at her, jaw tightening. His gaze was too knowing, too probing, as if he were trying to see through her skin and into the walls behind her. Then, abruptly, he stepped back. "Well," he said, "if you hear anything, don't go digging. Call me." She nodded once. He tipped his hat again, and then he said something that froze her blood. "Walls in that place can be tricky," he murmured. "Sometimes they hide more than drafts." He turned and walked away. She shut the door slowly, her hand trembling as she slid the lock into place. Only when the sound of the engines faded did she release the breath she'd been holding. The house let out a groan. Long, low, almost protective. Maggie whispered to the empty room, "He knows." They played the tape at noon. The bookstore's back room was small, lit by a single hanging bulb that hummed faintly. Old boxes lined the walls, filled with overflow inventory, outdated paperbacks, and unsold calendars from years past. The smell of old pages and cinnamon oil clung to the air. Ethan set an old cassette player on the table, the only one Nina had. Maggie placed the tape inside with gentle, almost reverent hands. When Ethan pressed play, the machine clicked, whirred, and then silence. A hiss. A low crackle of static, then a voice. A man's voice. Quiet, shaking. Speaking in gasps between breaths that sounded painful. "My name is Anthony Romano. If anyone ever hears this, I didn't know. I didn't know what they were doing downstairs. God help me, I didn't know." Nina clamped her hand over her mouth. Ethan's eyes widened. The voice continued. "They said the room was for storage, for the film equipment, for the family archives. But I heard them. I heard the children. They told me to stay out, said it was business, said I wasn't to question it." A choked sound, not quite a sob, not quite a breath, crackled through the speaker. "I tried to go to the sheriff, the old sheriff, not the son, the father. And he told me that if I valued my life, I'd forget what I heard, that the town was safer not knowing." Ethan's hands curled into fists. The tape crackled again, then the voice returned, weaker, shaking. "I'm leaving these tapes, the photos, all of it. Someone will find them, someone who isn't afraid of the truth. And when they do, they'll know this wasn't the work of one family. It was the work of a whole town deciding silence was easier than justice." A scraping sound, a final whisper. "Please, whoever finds this, don't let them bury us again." The tape clicked off. Maggie closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Nina sobbed openly, shoulders trembling. Ethan stared at the floor, jaw clenched, as if trying to keep from breaking. "That's enough," he whispered. "We take this to the state police. Today." "No," Nina said quickly. "Not yet. If Mercer finds out, he'll confiscate everything, or worse." "What do you propose?" Ethan asked. Nina wiped her face, steadying herself. "We make copies. Digital. Multiple. We send them anonymously to reporters out of town, to cold case investigators, to anyone who can't be controlled by this place." Maggie looked at the tape, at her trembling hands, at the weight of the voices that had waited decades to be heard. "We're going to finish what he started," she said quietly. "Anthony Romano left this for someone who wouldn't look away." She lifted her chin. "Well, we're here." That night, Maggie wasn't alone. Not physically. Ethan stood guard outside in his car, determined not to leave her unprotected, but emotionally. A presence lingered in the house with her. Not a ghost, not a spirit, a memory, a truth. The house no longer felt like a place of secrets. It felt like a place pleading for release. Maggie walked slowly through the hallway, hand brushing the wall as if offering comfort. When she passed the fireplace, a single cold draft whispered across her hand. A thank you, or a warning, or both. Upstairs she sat at her desk and opened her notebook. For a long time she simply stared at the blank page, listening to the faint hum of the old house. Then she began to write. Entry. October 21st. The walls are open now. The truth is breathing again. And the ones who kept it buried will come back for it, but I am not leaving, not this time. Silence ends here. She closed the notebook gently. Outside, somewhere deep in the trees, a branch snapped sharply, not from wind, from footsteps. She stood slowly, her pulse steady, calm, resolute. It's starting, she whispered. The house creaked in agreement. The next morning arrived without color. A pale, washed-out dawn crept across Redwood Falls like a ghost, dragging its own light behind it. The trees outside Maggie's window stood still, their branches heavy with silence. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if the world itself sensed something shifting beneath the surface. Maggie's phone buzzed just after sunrise. A text from Ethan. "They're on to us. Nina found Mercer at the shop early. Be ready." Her stomach tightened, but her hand stayed steady. She had lived through grief that hollowed her from the inside out. Fear, she realized, was smaller than loss. And she had already faced the worst loss of her life years ago. She walked through the house slowly, touching the walls with a kind of tenderness, as if saying goodbye to each room. She knew the house wasn't hers anymore, not in the way most people meant. It now belonged to everyone who'd ever been silenced inside it. When the knock came, it wasn't the slow, deliberate knock from the day before. It was thunder, fists pounding, voices calling her name, a command rather than a request. "Maggie Hale, Sheriff's Office, open the door." She didn't move at first. The house held its breath with her. "Maggie Hale, this is your final warning. Open the door." She reached the entryway, but instead of unlocking it, she turned and walked to the living room. Her pulse slowed. Her breathing deepened. On the mantel she had placed the cassette tape inside a sealed plastic bag. On the table, 3 USB drives, copies. In her purse, another copy, the one she would carry no matter what. She whispered to the house, "It's time." And then she opened the door. Sheriff Mercer stood on the porch, face red from the cold or anger. She couldn't tell. 2 deputies flanked him, their hands resting dangerously close to their holsters. "Mornin', Mrs. Hale," Mercer said, tightening his jaw. "We received a report you've been tampering with structural elements of this property without authorization. For your safety, I need to come inside." Maggie met his stare calmly. "You're not here about permits. You're here because you know what I found." His eyes twitched, a small, sharp motion, and she knew she was right. "Open space hidden in the walls," Mercer said, stepping forward. "Old houses have those. Contractors cut corners. Nothing you need to worry about." "Then why bring deputies?" she asked. Mercer's expression flattened. "Because you aren't cooperating." He pushed his way inside without waiting for permission. The house groaned, a long, low protest. He walked directly toward the fireplace, his boots thudding heavily, as if he had walked this house 100 times before. Maggie followed him, heart steady, watching the way his eyes drifted to the cracked open wall. "You had no right breaking into that," he said. "You had decades to open it yourself," she replied. "You didn't." His jaw flexed. "Some things are meant to stay buried." Maggie stepped closer, standing between him and the opening in the wall. "Not children." Mercer held her stare, and for a split second, just an instant, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, fear. "Take her outside," he said to the deputies. "I'm securing this area." One deputy reached for her arms, but before he touched her, a voice cut through the room. "Don't lay a hand on her." Ethan stood in the doorway, breathless, gripping a folder stuffed with printed documents. His face was pale, but his eyes burned. Mercer scoffed. "You don't belong here, kid." He didn't get to finish, because behind Ethan, 2 black SUVs rolled up the driveway. Not the county vehicles Mercer drove, but unmarked ones, the kind that belonged to state or federal authorities. Nina stepped out of the passenger side of the first SUV, followed by 2 investigators in dark jackets. Her chin lifted with a mixture of defiance and trembling grief. "Maggie," Nina said, voice shaking but strong, "I sent the files last night to the state police and to a federal cold case task force." She looked directly at Mercer. "They have everything." Mercer's face drained of color. The lead investigator stepped forward, flashing his badge. "Sheriff Daniel Mercer, we need you to step aside. We have a warrant to search this property and seize any evidence related to the missing persons cases from 1973 to 1981. Ethan exhaled shakily. Nina grabbed Maggie's hand. Mercer didn't move. For a tense moment, no one breathed. Then, slowly, like someone realizing the rope beneath his feet was snapping thread by thread, Mercer raised his hands. Not in surrender, not yet. But in a kind of exhausted resignation, his voice cracked. "You don't understand. My father, he protected this town." "He protected the criminals," the investigator said, "not the children." Mercer's shoulders sagged, and in that moment Maggie knew he wasn't a monster. He was a man raised inside a monster's house. The deputies backed away. The investigators stepped inside, and for the first time in nearly half a century, the hidden room wasn't a secret anymore. They opened the metal box at sunset. It took 2 crowbars and nearly an hour of work. Rust groaned, steel bent, dust erupted in clouds that tasted like copper and mold. Inside they found financial ledgers tied to the Romano family, envelopes filled with cash, undeveloped film, transcripts of coded messages, 3 cassette tapes, a list of names, a small metal pendant belonging to Tommy Geller. Nina collapsed into tears when she saw it. Ethan turned away, fists pressed to his forehead. The investigators handled everything gently, photographing each piece before placing it into evidence bags. Every label, every date, every scarred tape. Maggie stood behind them, watching silently. The house felt lighter with each item removed, as if exhaling old ghosts through its broken walls. When they reached the last item, one investigator paused. He held up a yellowed sheet of paper, fragile, edges frayed. A note, written in elegant slanted handwriting. Maggie recognized the signature, Anthony Romano. The note read, "To the person brave enough to open this wall, tell their families the truth. Tell them I'm sorry. And tell them I paid for my silence every day I lived." Maggie closed her eyes. The room felt warm suddenly, a soft warmth that brushed her cheek like a gratitude long overdue. A week later, the mansion was no longer a crime scene. The state police thanked Maggie for her courage. Federal investigators stayed in town interviewing families. Newspapers across Pennsylvania carried the headline, "Hidden Room Uncovered in Former Mafia Mansion. Cold Cases Reopened After 48 Years." Mercer was placed under investigation, though everyone sensed he had inherited guilt more than committed it. Ethan helped families reconnect with answers they never thought they'd receive. Nina collected donations for memorials to the children, and the mansion breathed easier. With the hidden room exposed, sunlight finally touched its floor for the first time in decades. Dust swirled in golden currents. Air moved freely. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt relieved. Maggie sat on the front steps one evening, wrapped in a knitted shawl, watching the sun settle behind the tree line. Leaves drifted across the yard like fragments of old pages turning. Ethan sat beside her. Nina sat on her other side. "You saved them," Nina whispered. Maggie shook her head gently. "No, they saved me. They gave my life meaning again." Ethan looked toward the house. "What will you do now?" "I'll stay," Maggie said, smiling softly. "This house carried too much pain for too long. It deserves someone who won't run." She inhaled the cool air deeply. "I won't run." The wind rustled through the branches, not with menace, with peace. For the first time since Thomas died, Maggie felt whole, not because the sadness had vanished, but because she finally carried something larger than her grief. Truth, purpose, the soft, aching beauty of a life rebuilt. She stood looking at the mansion, its cracked walls glowing in the amber light. "Some houses," she said quietly, "don't haunt people. They just wait for the right person to listen." A breeze whispered across the porch, brushing past her like a quiet thank you. She closed her eyes as the final sunbeam broke across the sky, warm and golden. And with a steady breath she whispered to no one and everyone, "You're free now." The house creaked softly, not in sorrow, not in warning, but in gratitude.